This is the last lecture in Module 9. We will talk about wholesale electricity markets and where they can go wrong. So the agenda for today is market power and wholesale electricity markets. And we'll look at one example of this, the California electricity crisis. So we've talked about how wholesale electricity markets worked and where they came from. We had vertical integration, we had monopolies, natural monopolies, and then we had deregulation. So we had markets that were deregulated, wholesale electricity markets that were deregulated. And what we mean by deregulated is that the states introduced competition in the wholesale electricity market. So they're no longer monopolies. Now wholesale markets are competitive. But sometimes they aren't perfectly competitive. Sometimes there's only a handful of suppliers, which means there's space for market power. And so let's remind ourselves how these wholesale markets work. We have an independent system operator sort of in the middle of supply and demand. And they use this wholesale market to coordinate the exchange of electricity. So you have a bunch of suppliers bidding supply functions. We saw that in the previous lectures. And the ISO, this independent system operator, then aggregates the supply functions into an aggregate supply. And then they have all the demand from all the users in the state or the region. And they aggregate up the demand and they intersect supply and demand to create market equilibrium prices. The market then ensures that the lowest cost generation is used to meet demand in each period. Why? Because you have a bunch of generators bidding supply functions, and if you bid too high, then you aren't going to be dispatched. Your electricity is not going to be used, and so you're not going to make any money. And so you have an incentive to bid lower supply functions. You bid lower prices. And so that is essentially creating competition and then lowering prices. We have in these markets usually several markets that operate at different timescales. We have forward markets, which are kind of like futures contracts or forward contracts in the sense that you might have large entities consuming some fixed quantity of electricity in the future, and so they, like Fort Collins might say, we want to consume, 100 megawatts of electricity in March of 2022, and so we're going to purchase that now. We're going to purchase that in a forward contract at a set price. So they can have long-term forward contracts. There's also the day-ahead market, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the market for electricity supplied and consumed 1 day in advance, exactly 24 hours in advance. And then there's the real-time market, which is clearing on a roughly 5-minute to 15-minute basis, and that's what's the demand in 5 minutes from now, or 5 minutes from now. And so you need, because there's no storage in the electricity market, you need to clear the supply and demand every 5 minutes. So that's the real-time market. And then there's the ancillary services market. This is the market for spare capacity, essentially. So California began the restructuring or deregulation in the United States, and many states have followed suit. But there was a problem in the early 2000s in California that kind of put a halt to the restructuring, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So prior to 1990s, the most electricity customers were served by what we defined as a vertically integrated regulated monopoly. So that's what we talked about when we introduced electricity markets. But during the 1990s, many states restructured their electricity markets, and the key feature of restructuring was the introduction of competition in the wholesale markets. And at the time, it looked like all states would restructure, but in 2000 to 2001, California's restructured market experienced an electricity crisis, and the wave of restructuring ceased. So why did California restructure in the first place, and why did many states decide that this was a good idea? Well, in 1993, California had an average retail price for electricity of 9.7 cents per kilowatt hour. That's what households were paying. The national average was only 6.8 cents per kilowatt hour. So Californians were paying a high price for electricity, and they wanted to lower the price. They thought that uh, in, uh, increasing competition in the wholesale markets would lower the retail price of electricity. Why were the prices high? Well, California utilities had made a series of bad investment decisions. They built nuclear power plants that had large fixed costs for construction. Those costs were higher than what were initially bid, and so they were in debt, and they needed to repay that debt. And to repay the debt, they passed the cost along to the consumers. Retail prices were fixed, but wholesale prices were not. So after the restructuring bill was passed in 1996, competition was allowed in generation. Transmission and distribution remained natural monopolies. So the wholesale market for electricity generation was competitive, meaning that the wholesale prices were not fixed, and so there was fluctuation in the wholesale market. But the retail prices were fixed. The prices that the homeowners and the businesses were paying for electricity were fixed. So you can imagine this might create a problem if the price that you can sell electricity at is fixed, but the wholesale market prices are not fixed. And this is kind of what was happening in Texas recently. So yeah, in the winter of 2021 in Texas, there was also an electricity crisis, but in that case, the retail prices were not fixed. The retail prices in many households that had signed up for real-time pricing, those retail prices fluctuated with wholesale prices, and that's why you saw households being sent bills of $5,000 per month or something like that. So when wholesale prices spiked, those prices were then passed on to consumers in Texas. But in California in the early 2000s, that wasn't the case. The retail prices were fixed. So when the wholesale prices spiked, those costs were not passed on to consumers, and this led to what we'll see bankruptcy for the generators. Utilities were required to divest a substantial portion of their generation plants. So prior to 1996, we had the vertical monopolies. In 1996, the restructuring bill was passed, and these utilities were required to basically split. And so what they did was they sold off some of their assets. They sold off some of their generating units and trying to create more competition. The retail prices were fixed at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Remember that they were at 9 point something on the previous slide. Now they're down to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So the state is hoping that the wholesale prices on average are going to be lower than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Initially, wholesale prices were volatile, but not overly high on average. In 1998, restructured markets begin operating. The market was supposed to consist of the forward market, which we discussed. It was supposed to consist of that plus the day-ahead market and the real-time market. The problem here is though the forward market never really materialized. It never got going. And utilities then purchase power on the day-ahead market. That's the longest they can purchase power in advance. So this leads to more volatile prices because the utilities weren't fixing prices for a substantial portion of their generation in advance. Until June 2000, wholesale prices were extremely volatile, but the average prices were no more than $50 per megawatt hour, which isn't really that bad. But in June 2000, there was a huge spike in electricity prices. You can see on this this figure here, these are the average wholesale prices per week, and they were fairly low, below $50 per megawatt hour, up until about April 2000, and then in June they spike up to as high as $450 per megawatt hour, and then even going further in January of 2001, December 2000, January 2001, they jumped up even higher than that. So what's happening here to cause those spikes? And what's the consequence of those spikes? And so uh, the spikes are essentially when supply is insufficient to meet demand. And because there's no storage, that leads to blackouts. And this figure also shows the blackouts that occurred over that time period. So there were some substantial blackouts during that time. So what happened? Utilities had to be bailed out by the state. Why? Well, you can see that on 2 slides ago, the prices were spiking at over $500 per megawatt hour. The utilities had to buy the wholesale electricity at over $500 per megawatt hour, but they couldn't sell it for more than 6 cents per kilowatt hour, which would be roughly $60 per kilowatt hour, or $60 per megawatt hour. So they were essentially going broke. That's what this first bullet point is saying here. Wholesale prices were $143 per megawatt hour on average in June 2000. Utilities had to buy power at these prices and sell it to consumers at $60 per megawatt hour. So they were losing money left and right. These high wholesale prices led to enormous profits for generating companies. So if you were a seller of electricity at $143 per megawatt hour, you were pretty happy. But the utilities buying it were pretty unhappy. Utilities such as Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, went bankrupt in 2001, and Southern California Edison also nearly went bankrupt. And the state spent over $1 billion per month buying power for the utilities and supplying it to the consumers. So why did this California electricity crisis happen? There's a nice paper by Severin Borenstein, Jim Bushnell, and Frank Wolak from in the American Economic Review that breaks this down if you're curious. But here it is in a nutshell. Demand was high relative to electricity generation capacity. So it was a hot summer. That's going to increase demand because people turn on their air conditioning when it's hot. Air conditioning requires electricity, and the bad part is that people require air conditioning during the peak time anyways, so between 5 and 7 p.m., so that's going to put excess demand during the peak time. Supply was low because they were in a drought year, so hydropower capacity was low. And so you can imagine if supply is the supply curve shifts inward and the demand curve shifts outward, then you get extremely high prices. There was market power by generators, so the generators knew that this was happening and they withheld some of their power, just like a monopolist would do. In this case, they're oligopolists because there's several of them competing, but they withhold some of their power to increase prices even more. There was very little power sold in using forward contracts, or essentially no forward markets, which means that the utilities couldn't lock in the prices ahead of time. They had to buy power in the real-time market. And then retail prices did not adjust, so consumers did not reduce consumption. So if you can imagine, if your price is fixed, you have no idea what's going on in the wholesale market. You don't know that you should be reducing consumption, so you just turn on your AC unit and supply or demand power just like you normally would. But if your retail price was fluctuating with the wholesale price, then you would, and you got notices of this, then you would cut your consumption. So the reading for this is A State of Gloom. It's an Economist article on electricity crises, particularly the one in California. Um, it gives some nice lessons for why these things happen and what are the fixes, what are the problems with restructuring. And it's also, you can take some of the lessons from this and apply them to what happened in Texas recently. And so you should be asking yourself, why did this crisis occur? We just outlined some of the issues, but the Economist article might have a few others. What is the NIMBY or the NIMBY problem? It's the not in my backyard problem. And then think to yourself, what is one technology that would almost certainly lessen or remove completely the problem California had?